good afternoon. My name is Nicola Schmidt. I'm the Director of Programs from Democracy Reporting International. Welcome to our webinar to discuss national security strategies in the EU based on DRI's work and interest in the current development of a German national security strategy. Let's give it maybe one or two more minutes to give colleagues a chance to join for our discussion. I can see people are joining. I know that the participants will only see us here, the panel. We are not seeing you. That's why when later in the discussion, when you have a question or you want to make a comment, please put it in the chat. I may also have a chance to call on individuals to make their contribution orally, but we'll have to see how that works. So the safest way will be the chat. Great. I'd say we start. Welcome to our event on democracy as an aspect of security policy. We are from Democracy Reporting International. My name is Nicola Schmidt. I'm the Director of Programs. I'll be moderating today's webinar, and I'm joined by two distinguished guests and my colleague and our Executive Director, Michael Meyer-Resende, by Ambassador Maria Leisner of Sweden, and by Daniel Hegedus from the German Marshall Fund. They will share some thoughts on the topic today. Let me just say by way of introduction why we are doing it, why we're doing this webinar today. Germany, as you may know, has in its coalition treaty, the new government has agreed the development of a comprehensive national security strategy, and they are in the process of developing and finalizing this strategy under the auspices of the German Federal Foreign Office. We from Democracy Reporting International consider foreign policy and any foreign policy action as a potential support to democracy and democratic development. And we are very much convinced that the aspects of democracy should be reflected in any national security strategy. This has become abundantly clear earlier this year with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has here in Germany specifically resulted in some quite fundamental questioning of our own German foreign policy security conceptions. And what has also become clear over those past months is that there has been a number of misconceptions and frames that have guided Germany's foreign policy over the past years, which seem to have proven wrong, especially now when looking at some events in the past years, when placing a lot of effort and importance on cooperation with authoritarian regimes rather than placing internal democracy or the democraticness of policy making and decision making at the heart of a foreign and security policy. So for us at DRI, to inform that debate, we've been looking and accompanying this process of drafting a national security policy, and as part of that, we have conducted a study on how democracy is reflected in the security strategies of other democratic countries in Europe and beyond. And this is what we want to present today and to discuss. We want to discuss what does democracy mean for security, especially in Europe, and we want to exchange on good practices in the field. And Firstly, Michael Meyer-Resende, who is the co-founder and the executive director of Democracy Reporting International, will introduce the findings of our study. Then Ambassador Maria Leisner of Sweden, she's an ambassador at the Department for International Law, Human Rights and Democracy, will share some thoughts coming from Sweden and presenting some thoughts on how Sweden deals with these issues, followed by Daniel Hegedus, who is the senior program officer at the German Marshall Fund, who will share his thoughts on the topic. And then afterwards, we'll have some time for discussion and question. Michael, I'll hand over to you to introduce our study. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicola. Hello, everybody. Good to see you. I'm sorry that I don't have the best camera with me. It's just my fuzzy computer camera. I'm moving a lot these days and just forgot the better camera. I hope what I say will be less fuzzy than this camera vision here. Yes, as Nicola said, we are doing a number of researches into the connection of democracy and security, in particular because of Germany now drafting its first ever security strategy. And of course, as an organization that supports democracy, we want to make sure, or we promote that that concern is highlighted quite strongly in that security strategy. We have looked for this study into the security strategies of 13 countries. In most of the cases, they were called security strategies. Sometimes they're updates that have a slightly different name. Sometimes it's a foundational report, but security strategy, we mean here in a broad way. It doesn't have to be only documents that say security strategy on top, but it's if they're materially dealing with security and foreign policy, we consider them as relevant documents for the study. And I just share some headline findings that we had from doing that. The first is perhaps that increasingly democracy has moved up the agenda of security in these strategies. Special shout out, I would say, to the Czech foreign ministry. They already in 2015 included threats from authoritarian regimes as a serious concern for their foreign policy, and that was ahead of the curve, I would say, where in most other policy documents that was not very articulated. At the moment, it's quite articulated also in the strategy of the Slovak Republic, of the United States, the UK, and indeed also of Sweden. The Swedish documents are quite explicit about that. I would say, talking about democracy and foreign policy, we can talk about three different things, and some documents are a little bit fuzzy about that. So I think the first level would be, to which extent are authoritarian regimes abroad dangerous for ourselves? So thinking of Germany, how dangerous are authoritarian regimes for the interest of the German population, of everybody living here in Germany? And that's one level, and that level is quite often mentioned in the security strategies, in particular the fear or the concern about foreign disinformation campaigns to undermine democracy, support to extremist parties, or cyber attacks. So that we read quite a lot. Then we would have a second level, which is the threats to international security. So we could say, for example, that the Russian full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, it's maybe not a doesn't directly affect the security of Portugal, if you want. It's far away, and you could say, well, it's, you know, for the Portuguese population, what's the issue? But of course, then we have to think of everybody's interest in international security and of knock-on effects. So you could say every state today should have an interest in a stable international order as an objective as such under the United Nations. And in that sense, one should articulate the challenge from authoritarian regimes, but also there are knock-on effects, of course. So again, very obvious case, the Russian war has led to this food crisis in many countries. And I would say that's in all our interests that Nigerians or Somalis or Ethiopians do not suffer from hunger. And that, I think, should be articulated also, and is not very articulated yet in most of the security strategies. They tend to only take the domestic view. The third level would be, of course, then to talk also about the populations in those authoritarian regimes. So we could say we also have an interest that Russians can live in freedom and have checks and balances and a free media sphere. So I think it's useful to somehow distinguish a little bit whose interest exactly we are talking about when we talk about this threat. Overall, my feeling was that on many of these points, there could be a lot more research. Maybe there is research that we are not yet aware of that should be brought together. It could be formulated in much clearer ways. And in some way, I feel we are a bit at the beginning of this slightly unfortunate journey to rethink international relations in a context where we have authoritarian regimes, some of which are very aggressive and directly attacking democracy. So this, for me, was a takeaway that I think there's a lot more work to be done on that. Second takeaway, we looked at institutional structures also. So, you know, you have policies, but if you have no institutional structures underpinning them, there may just be words on paper. So it's always interesting to see how our institutions set up. And you have a number of countries that have national security councils that basically are the focal point for any security challenge and objective. And usually there is a presence of the foreign ministry in these national security councils. And then the question is, how well is the concern for democracy and human rights institutionally anchored in foreign ministries? And there we see quite different practices. For example, the United States, the State Department has an entire department dealing with human rights and democracy, and it's powerful, has a director who's at the same level as all the other directors, so it's institutionally given high importance. And at the other end of the spectrum, I could mention Germany, where in the Foreign Office you don't have a department for democracy and human rights, you don't even have a unit that deals with democracy. You don't even have a single person that carries democracy in the title. So that's a place here in Berlin where I think we have a gap between stated ambition, because officially democracy is a core task of German foreign policy, without institutional underpinning. The third point that also comes across, we look at security strategies where you may or may not find something on democracy and human rights, but then there's a whole different track of information about foreign policy and democracy in the field of cooperation. So I think almost all the foreign policies of democracies also have this cooperation angle, and there you find much more often human rights and democracy as an objective. So it's more seen through that lens. And often, I think, in political debates, there's a bit the idea that democracy in other countries and human rights is about our values, because we support these values, so we have to support that somewhere else. While other things like security is seen more as interest. This is a hardcore foreign policy, which, you know, you have to do, and then you have to find a balance between these values and interest. And one thing that I would love to change everywhere in democracies is this kind of thinking, because I think democracy and human rights abroad should also be our interest. We should not just think we are so nice to help other people to have checks and balances and better protections at home, but we should also see that it's really also in our interest. Of course, it's a value, but it's also in our interest. And if we accept that, it should take place at the core of our foreign policy making and not be relegated to doing some nice projects and nice conferences. But when push comes to shove, when you have to do the real hard decisions, then, well, it's just a value, and now we have to look at interest. I think this is one of the biggest mistakes we have been making for a long time. And if we could change that, we would be more safe. And the most obvious example for me is indeed Russia again. It's, of course, easy at the moment to use that example because it's so visible and so blatant. But I would say that the human rights community, the supporters of democracy, had the most realistic understanding of Russia. And they were often looked at as the idealists, yes, who want to do something nice, but we deal with reality, we deal with trade and gas and military, and we know what's really important. And it turned out those communities were quite unrealistic and had a wrong perception of the Russian threat. And so I think we would all be safer if this concern for democracy and human rights would be really anchored at the heart of the political decision-making systems and would be seen as essential element of our security. And the fourth point is that if we think about that, we cannot ignore the fact that some democracies can also become risky for our security when they make turns towards the extreme. And the Trump administration is the obvious example here. And inside the EU, it's an example of Hungary. And I found interesting that there was one EU member state that was super explicit about this. And I found that refreshing and very realistic. And if I was a citizen, I would ask my government about that. And the one government that gave a straightforward answer is the Danish government. In its security strategy, it says very straightforwardly that if Trump is re-elected, we have a big problem for our security. And it says that the Hungarian case is challenging, but still manageable because it's a small member state. We can discuss if we agree with that, but that this kind of government would become hugely problematic for Danish security if it took place in a place like France or somewhere else. So these are my four takeaways, or our four takeaways from this study. Overall, as I said earlier, I think there's really still a lot to think about and to do, and also a lot of convincing to do, because I do feel the old thinking of democracy is some kind of idealism, which can be catered by funding some projects, is still quite strong, and hopefully we can change that. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you very much, Michael, for setting the stage and for introducing the study. We're looking at different national security strategies or the work being done at the moment to develop that. I'd like to hand over now to you, Ambassador Leisner, to give us a bit of input from the Swedish perspective.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Democracy Reporting International very much for inviting me to this panel discussion, and also for making me aware of your very, very interesting report. I find it very timely and quite interesting. And as Germany, I believe that Sweden and everyone else in Europe, we have had to rethink our security policy and our entire foreign policy since we have not had this threat against our own security as well, basically since the end of the Second World War. We're in a very dire situation since the illegal aggression by Russia on Ukraine, and it has completely changed the way that we have organized our foreign policy and our security policy until now. So it's not necessarily my competence to give you feedback on your analysis of Sweden's work with this theme, because in that case I would need to coordinate with a number of my colleagues in order to give you a proper response. But from my position, being at the Department for Human Rights and International Law and Democracy, the previous government strive for democracy, and I continue to work with democracy-related issues here, not the least the EU 23 chairmanship that Sweden is going to assume in less than a month's time. Basically, I would like to say that we're 2 months into our new government, and many positions are set, many are reconfirmed, for example, our application to become members of NATO. When it comes to our democracy and human rights priorities, they remain, even though they will be slightly set in a slightly different landscape, given the current situation, with a much larger focus on our vicinity. The Nordic Baltic countries, our relations there are very important. Our EU relations are really important. We value the transatlantic link very highly. And we are absolutely, for us, it is an absolutely vital interest that the EU is strong and that we are able to also gain full membership of NATO. So that is, given Russia's aggressions against Ukraine, it's a question of pure security that has taken over most of our previous foreign policy, and everything needs to be realigned. Now, we regard Russia's atrocities as an attack on the international legal system and on intergovernmental cooperation. We believe also that there is a very clear link between Russia's breach of peace in Europe to its democratic decline, that the domestic repression is mirrored in its external aggression. Defending the sovereignty and freedom of Ukraine is one of Sweden's most prioritized tasks ahead. They are basically our front line. That is the way to defend Europe's freedom and democracy, and Sweden's freedom and democracy. So this is very much, I would say, in general, how we view the situation. It means that democracy is still very much a basic core value, but I would agree that your analysis that democracy has not yet entered into the realm of security policy is currently true also in Sweden. Democracy is still viewed primarily as a value, as a very important value. However, through our cooperation between the Swedish government and the International Academic Research Institute of VDEM, a variety of democracies, based in Europe, but international, we have developed, based on their policy papers on case for democracy, we have developed internal working material that is currently being used in our organization. And one particular policy brief that I would like to draw your attention to is on democracy and security. And the conclusions there completely coincides with what you're writing in the executive summary, which is that the democratic peace axiom is confirmed. Democracies do not fight wars against one another, and the spread of democracy does reduce wars and internal conflicts. It is soundly confirmed by a wealth of rigorous academic studies. There is no case of a war in any pair of states whose democratic level both was above 0.61% on the VDEM Electoral Democracy Index. And this is quite interesting because I believe that this is a different way. Now, we did have the conflict database from the University of Uppsala confirming that since decades ago. And now we can confirm that also based on VDEM's a fairly new and very, very extensive database on democratic variables. They also can see that it is beneficial to live in a region that is to its majority democratic. There is less risk of having conflicts. And they point at exactly what you're pointing at when it comes to the why. Why is it so? Because democracies are better at absorbing and channeling discontent through legal institutional means and accountability mechanisms that in turn lower the risk of domestic conflict. But also they talk about 3 different levels of lowering the risk of interstate war, the factors. Vertical, horizontal, and diagonal, which is first free and fair multi-party elections, And secondly, institutional constraints on the executive. And thirdly, civil society accountability mechanisms. And when you have those, you will have all these restraining factors that makes a government think not just once, but perhaps twice and perhaps even 3 times, and using a different set of tools in the toolbox. So there are factual reasons for why authoritarian regimes are less interested in peaceful resolutions of conflicts. I think this also merits some extra research, and this is, as you said, Mr. Meyer-Resende, it's definitely an area where we need to do more research. Now, the Swedish government is also, we have a new national security advisor that started his work just a couple of weeks ago. We also fairly recently, I believe it was last year, we instituted the National Board of Psychological Defense, which is a way of reacting to the first set of challenges posed by authoritarian regimes, which is direct attacks against individual countries, democracies. And I believe that it is very important for Sweden to become aware of the increasing number of countries looking at democracy and human rights as a security interest, not just as a set of values. So, as I said, it's very, very useful to have your report. A couple of words on how we would like to shape our EU Council presidency with respect to democracy and security. We are going to push for 3 different areas within the field of democracy, human rights, which is EU external democracy work. We have a study together with International IDEA looking at how the European Union is working externally with democracy and its external action, and with a view of revising the EU Action Plan for Human Rights and Democracy. Secondly, we wish to focus on human rights defenders, because the EU has room for improvement in our way of dealing with and supporting human rights defenders. And thirdly, an important theme that is very linked to the lack of democracy is the fight against corruption. And apart from that, Sweden is going to push for the nexus between democracy, human rights, and rule of law to be reflected in all parts of the EU foreign and development policy during our presidency. Then our expectations for Germany's security strategy from a partner's perspective. I would say that, first of all, our European and Western partners, as I explained, are more central to Sweden than ever. And EU, the NATO, and OSCE, of course, are in particular focus. And we will continue to seek a closer and closer collaboration with our close allies. And I believe it's important that we move along with the same understanding and the same evaluation of the risks that we are facing. Let me conclude then by thanking you for organizing this panel discussion, and particularly for producing this quite interesting and thought-provoking report. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this very interesting input and touching on so many interesting aspects, actually, both internally and Swedish views and response, at the same time also highlighting how democracy is not yet as clearly anchored maybe in security as we definitely from DRI would like to see it. That was very interesting. Also sharing some of the research that's being done by VDEM. Michael also mentioned that in some instances, what we noticed in our study is that maybe some research is still missing, but there's some research on some aspects, which is really already very, very clear and very detailed, and has been done for quite a long time. So it provides quite a good basis. So really very interesting. I hope we can talk about it a little bit more later, but I'd like to first turn to Daniel now, who is the Senior Program Officer at the German Marshall Fund, also based here in Berlin, like us at GRI. And Daniel, I look forward to the thoughts that you're going to share with us now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nicola, for having me. And I also would like to congratulate to DRI for this particularly relevant and timely study, which is putting under the microscope how the threats posed by democracies are perceived in the security strategies of 13 Western countries. Being in charge of the Central Europe programming of GMF, I was particularly happy to see that Central and Eastern European countries are from time to time not only mentioned as troublemakers and as one of the sources of both democratic instability, but potentially also challenges to the European security order in the current context, but also as best practices. And that Czechia and Slovakia were mentioned as both having a pioneer role in acknowledging the role of the authoritarian threat to the European security, and also for showing an advanced understanding of this new threat landscape. While I completely agree with the study and with the authors, and I couldn't even agree more with Michael, that democracy is not a question of, or not only a question of values, but also a question of interest. If you allow me, I would like to raise 3 questions / points about the democracy and security nexus, a bit playing the role of the devil's advocate, not because of any disagreement, but potentially just to facilitate further thinking and that further research, what you also mentioned in this excellent introduction. So the first of my 3 questions would be whether, and I think this is a particularly relevant question from a German perspective, whether classical security strategies can accommodate a comprehensive democratic approach to security, covering all important aspects of the democracy and security nexus. I also made a categorization of the different democracy-related challenges to security. My category is a bit different from Michael's one, but I think we can distinguish between 3 main threats or challenges posed by authoritarian players. The first is the classical hard security challenge, may it be of military nature or economic, with regard to the security of supply chains. And I think these are the issues which are very well addressed already in most of the existing security strategies of EU and NATO member states. There is the second challenge, which is posed by the malicious foreign meddling of authoritarian players into the democratic decision-making processes and electoral processes of Western countries. Since 2016 at latest, there is also a growing awareness of that challenge, and this became also practically business as usual from the perspective of policy planners when it comes to security strategies. And there is the third category, which was raised by the Danish security strategy and also underlined by Michael, and it reflects on the fact that domestic autocratization in member states of our democratic community can pose even deeper and more existential threat to our security order. And meanwhile, concerning the first category, of course, distance matters, and I fully agree with Michael that the security perception of Estonia might be different from the security perception or threat perception of Portugal. But obviously, in case of integrations and defense alliances where joint defense clauses and mutual assistance clauses exist, this is practically a security planning for a whole transatlantic community and for the European Union. So it's obvious that distance matters, but we are sitting in the same boat, and we know how are our challengers, adversaries, or enemies. But how to address the question if we practically speak about our allies, may it be small or big ones? You mentioned the case of the United States. I would like to add that in the past decade, Europe was always at the verge of collapse by every single French presidential elections as well. And I think it's very difficult to reflect on that sort of challenge, especially because we lack the appropriate pitch and approach to it. How can we frame political changes in countries which are officially or allies, which from the perspective of the majority of the electorate of that country appears to be a legitimate democratic change in power? It's obvious that potential future political changes in the United States, in France, in Hungary, in other member states pose that very existential challenge. And I think this is even more existential than the first two ones. Because if we just ask the question, is NATO prepared to deter classical military threats to member states of the organizations, then I think the answer would be yes, it is prepared. Is NATO or the European Union prepared to address the challenges posed by member states, which on the one hand undermine their unity, and on the other hand, practically make it impossible that these organizations respond in an adequate manner to external challenges? Then I think my response would be no. Or European Union and or military alliances, first and foremost NATO, is not ready to address this challenge. And I think we see here that it's a very complex landscape, but I think we are really far from the point where we could argue that we can bring this complexity in one single strategy, or just that we could elaborate to have a response mechanism to all the challenges. My second point would be that how can we align in our security strategies democracy with geopolitics? How can we address the fact that the West from time to time needs authoritarian powers as allies? And how can we address the fact or the situation that in the same time these countries are our allies and pose security challenges to us? And I think the most obvious example is Turkey. If the question is whether Turkey is an important security provider of NATO and the guarantor of the joint security in the North Atlantic space, then the answer is yes, it is. Is Turkey also a source of threat both to NATO and EU security? And I think we more or less would agree that yes, it is. We just should mention how the country, together with Hungary, is blocking actually the NATO accession of Sweden and Finland, how from time to time Ankara blackmailed the European Union and threatened it with renewed migration waves. So it's a very delicate and very complex situation. And again, the question is, how can we address in security strategies that sort of challenges without being hypocritical and without opening or approach up to very legitimate criticism of having double standards. And obviously there is also a last question here, whether the threat posed by these allies will not be bigger if we call them out for their authoritarian qualities and approaches, if we call them out for their lack of trustworthiness in the alliance, and if we more or less alienate them from ourselves. So I don't have here any sort of responses how we could try to answer these challenges, but I think it's important to raise them because even in the past decades, this issue of double standards, when it came to really authoritarian, if not totalitarian, allies of the West, may it be Saudi Arabia or other ones, reappeared in the international discourse, it always undermined the legitimacy and the credibility of the West itself. And coming to my last point, It is whether our vocabulary is fine-grained enough to catch the core of the challenge, what we face. Is Jordan or Morocco more authoritarian than Turkey? I think no, they are not. Do they pose bigger security challenge to EU member states than Turkey does? Then my reply is no, they don't. Authoritarian countries are not posing the same challenge for their democratic neighbors, and it's not only a question of distance, but a couple of other factors. And of course, it would be very difficult to get a homogeneous or unified model explaining that behaviors, but I think we have to reflect on certain differences in that regard. There were some hints in the DRI report, and I fully agree that I think the main source of political instability, which at the end of the day translates to security challenges, are the unpredictability, the intransparency in authoritarian system, and their lack of accountability. Aside of that categorization, I think it makes sense to differentiate between status quo authoritarian powers and in some form revisionist authoritarian powers. And I think if we take a bottom-up approach, then we see that practically two sorts of authoritarian regimes are dangerous. And it's really ironic, those which are declining and those which are really raising in power. So practically authoritarian systems are much worse in managing change and instability than democratic systems. And that's the sort, or that's the source which of the instability, which then also translates at the international arena. And really just my last thoughts that I think we also see these differences within the European Union. We have two long-time autocratizing EU member states, Hungary and Poland. And it's important to underline that meanwhile, the differences in democratic qualities are not necessarily obvious. Of course, Hungary has been autocratizing for 12 years, Poland only for 7 years. There are differences in the extent how democracy could be deconstructed or democratic constitutional systems could be deconstructed. But even if we just take a look on for example, VDEM or Freedom House scales, we will see that the quality of Hungarian democracy is lower. We are not speaking about the democratic system anymore, but the speed of the democratic decline in Poland is faster. Nevertheless, the threat these two countries pose to European security are completely different, because their autocratization is embedded in fundamentally different geopolitical strategies. Poland is behaving like an old-fashioned NATO autocracy in the 70s or 60s, like Portugal or Greece under the military junta. It's practically using geopolitical loyalty as a leverage, and is trading this leverage of geopolitical loyalty for non-interference into domestic affairs, which otherwise would be present on the EU political agenda into the autocratization of the country. In the case of Hungary, the Orbán regime is trading geopolitical disloyalty as leverage, and uses geopolitical disloyalty as an opportunity to blackmail partners and allies into cooperation. So we see that there are really several categories in which authoritarian powers can differ, both within the European Union and in the broader neighborhood. And I think we have to take these differences into consideration. Again, here definitely further research is required, but I'm convinced that our vocabulary and understanding is not really fine-grained, and until it won't be, if we just simply refer to a blanket authoritarian threat to security, I fear that it won't necessarily be convincing, not only for partners, but potentially also for the citizens of our democracies. And again, development in that regard would be crucial. But I'm stopping here. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for this, and so many thoughts you shared. Some of them were pointing to some of the questions I also had at the beginning of our discussion, and I may pose some of these questions to you and Ambassador Leisner and Michael now for discussion, but I also wanted to invite our audience to raise questions if they have any, and please do use the chat function, the question and answer function, and the chat function of Zoom that you can find at the bottom panel for that. And I will then read those out and post the questions to our panelists. But I had, as part of my questions for this discussion, and maybe this is a question to ask to Ambassador Leisner, because what has come up now also in what Daniel said is really, how do we define a threat to security? And both you, Ambassador, but also Daniel, you have pointed to the challenges with that there's some threats that are maybe more easily defined or that are more visible. Michael also pointed out that in some of the national security strategies that we looked at, some countries are specifically named or some threats are specifically named. But we also realize, and I agree with Daniel, that this referring to a blanket authoritarian threat to security may not be convincing, or we may run the danger of being accused of double standards, because there will be a threat coming from one authoritarian regime, but then we will not see the threat, or we will not define another authoritarian regime as threatful as well. And I was wondering whether there's something you could share, Ambassador Leisner, on that, on how Sweden maybe has addressed this. Also, this new psychological defense agency seems to be quite interesting in that regard, referring especially to, I understand, a specific threat coming from disinformation and this meddling in democratic policies or democratic regimes. So maybe that you could share some thoughts on that. And I have some more questions also for you, Daniel and Michael, later, if there's nothing coming from our audience.
Thank you, Nicola. Well, I very much agree with the three levels of challenges posed by authoritarian regimes that you mentioned. The first one being hard security challenges, and the second one being the meddling into a specific country's internal domestic policies, elections, and the like, or just agenda setting. I mean, there are both evident and subtle ways of interfering domestically in order to achieve a specific political result that the authoritarian regime would benefit from. And what is obvious is naturally, if there is meddling directly in the electoral processes, as we know was the case in the United States, where Russia was responsible. But there are also the campaigns from troll factories that have affected us in the long run. And if I may leave a little bit even though it is impossible, but if I may leave my hat as ambassador at the foreign ministry aside and look at another area where I in previous positions have been engaged, I believe that the influence that other authoritarian regimes have had on the discourse in Europe when it comes to refugees, and particularly the 2015 wave of refugees from the bombings, the Putin bombings of the large cities in Syria were also, because of Russia's actions, some larger camps in Iran, where there were a number of Afghan refugees, were actually opened after actions from Russia. So both of these two streams of refugees were produced by Russia. Inciting troll factories, and some of which we know where they emanated from. And this has shaped the polarization that we've seen in many of our countries in Europe, and the discourse on issues such as refugees. And I do believe that this has been a long-term operation with a specific ambition to achieve a change of attitudes in Europe and an increased polarization. So there are a number of ways, easy to detect and more difficult to detect, that an authoritarian regime can challenge democracy from within in Europe. And we have started to look at it and reshape our institutions to be more alert and to refine our ways of dealing with it. But I think it is a work that needs to continue. And then the hard security challenge. And then the third one, raised evidently by Denmark, which I find quite interesting now, the risk, the more existential risk that domestic autocratization is representing. I believe that over time, it is difficult when you have the ambition, as has the European Union, and that I believe all of us in the Western Hemisphere have increased to focus to build alliances with like-minded democracies. It is not easy to keep those alliances over time, because we all tend to change. And when you lock in a certain set of countries in a group with statutes, with a mission, etc., it becomes, for geopolitical reasons, very, very difficult to make changes to the membership of that group of allied countries, even though some of them may no longer be part of that community of democratic countries that you originally wished to strengthen your relationships with. And I'm not mentioning any specific organizations here, but I'm not thinking about just one. This is a very interesting topic where I don't think anyone would have the answer. While on the one hand, some intergovernmental organizations have sought and are trying to seek to find mechanisms whereby you would be able to rethink your membership. Now, in the end, I think those efforts are doomed not to work, because geopolitics will always turn up. And there is a price, and that price in the current situation we are in is evidently too high to make any changes. So over time, any alliance of democracies, regardless of what mission it has, will increasingly face this problem of the internal autocratization process, and will over time not find any ways, I'm afraid, to grapple with it, even though I think that the EU is developing some ways of dealing with it that could or could not be efficient. So that would actually be, my question over to you, because it's something that I, in very many different moments during the past 5 to 10 years have encountered, and sometimes I've had to practically deal with them. And it's quite difficult. And still, we have a stronger need than ever to strengthen bonds with other democracies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these thoughts, Ambassador, and also for this question. We have 2 questions from our participants here, and I will read out. You can also look at them in the F&A question and answer section below. And the first one is very much aligned with one of the questions I was interested in asking as well, and it's Anthony Smith asking, my impression is that there is progress in the identification of growing authoritarianism as a national security risk, but less progress on proposing coherent responses. To what extent do the various national security strategies try to address the underlying democratic governance issues, or do they just respond to the specific risks, such as supply chains, conflict, migration, etc.? And that one of my questions was also really, how can we practically integrate the different issues and the corresponding responses in a national security strategy? And Daniel, you had started to think about that in what you were saying and posing some of these issues about also how one would align it. Can a single strategy be enough? Is our vocabulary detailed enough with that? And I'm wondering whether you would be able to expand a little bit on that, also taking this question of Anthony into account.
Thank you so much, Nicola. I will try, but I think that question is partially also for Michael, because there is a clear part of it how these different issues are present in the security strategies which DRI put under the microscope. I think I just have a very, very superficial response to the question how this comprehensive approach could be accommodated, and that would be that I think potentially general foreign policy strategies or overarching foreign policy strategies have more space and are not necessarily so streamlined to external security threats that could be better accommodate such a comprehensive approach. But I also underlined at the beginning that I'm just raising questions and not necessarily delivering responses to the problem. But if I have the floor, that potentially I would also just say a couple of words to the second question, and also to address certain points raised by Ambassador Leisner. I fully agree with the second question that, of course, there is repeatedly lip service and demonstrated understanding of authoritarianism related challenges in the communication of the German federal government and also other West European crucial member states of the European Union. However, I think we see a big discrepancy between the words and the acts in that regard. And I am not necessarily sure that the German federal government, may that be under the 16 years of Angela Merkel or under the new coalition, that they are also walking the talk. And I just would like to underline, for example, the recent moves of the German federal government, which tried to escalate the question of the suspension of the Hungarian cohesion funds and the addressing of the potential Hungarian blockade to the 18 billion financial aid to Ukraine and the global corporate tax scheme, in a way which was surprisingly similar to how the German Council presidency in 2020, that time also tried to settle the Polish-Hungarian blockade to the MFF that time, which shows that there is always an approach rather to try to accommodate the interest of autocratizing governments in the European Union, instead of trying to make a clear stand, even if with a qualified majority voting, the question could be solved in the Council. But instead of that approach, the German federal government tries to forge a compromise with unanimity at the level of the European Council, which will be impossible. So we see this conflict avoiding approach, and I think it's not necessarily what is required to have a committed defense of democratic security in the European Union or in NATO. And the second, that I think this German approach particularly reflects the attitude of both having the cake and eating it. Of course, no one would like to see a global politics divided into different blocks, but it's not only a question of the Western approach. It's also a question how authoritarian countries pursue their strategic goals, how they react on certain challenges, or how they simply react on vocal criticism. And I fear that in that regard, even if we acknowledge that China and other global players and cooperation with them is essential to solve certain global challenges like climate change and other ones, without certain level of conflict, one cannot committedly raise the issues, violation of human rights, for example, or the lack of democracy in certain ways. So I think, no, it's not possible to defend democracy and avoid any source of conflicts with authoritarian great powers. And very briefly, my third point, that I fully agree that geopolitics always kick in, but it doesn't mean that we don't have had and don't have windows of opportunities. I think since the early 2000s, the Western community, and especially the European Union, simply neglected investment in democratic societies. This is demonstrated by the fact that the Citizens' Rights and Values program of the European Commission, which is directly funding and supporting civil society initiatives and democratic initiatives in EU member states, just started recently. And the sheer fact that important democracy donors like the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands very often are unable to support democracy in crumbling EU member states, for the simple reason that democracy assistance is linked to development aid. And according to their national legislations, they don't have the appropriate budget to do so. And I know that it will be a rather unpopular suggestion, but I think decoupling democracy assistance from development aid would be absolutely crucial if member states of the West would like to address democratic decline in other members of the community. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for these additional thoughts. I think it really points to the complexity of the issue, and also how, you know, your example now also of development aid and how to decouple democracy support from that also points to the fact that when you have a strategy or a policy, you will need to underpin it with some action. You know, you have to do something, and money, or in, let's say, aid to other countries may one way, or supporting specific activities in countries will be one way to do that. One of my questions, in addition, like linked to that, was also how does this then possibly interfere or challenge the principle of sovereignty of states, especially when, as you had said also before, you have the situation where you may have a democratically elected or democratically legitimated authoritarian government. How to deal with that? How this is possibly getting more and more complex, but these are some of the challenges that exists as well with regards to security, and how do we get away from threats to our own national security from potential countries that are maybe not immediately threatening our own national security, but are posing a threat in a particular region or in a particular environment that may then have a ripple effect on us. I don't know, I'll turn to Michael now. Maybe he has answers for us on all of these questions, but I'm sure he definitely has some more thoughts also, especially with regards to the study that we have done, and maybe some of the insights from that and some of the recommendations stemming from that study. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Nicola. Yeah, I would love to say I can answer all these questions and then we can end our discussion. That won't be the case, but I perceive maybe I give you feedback on a few points. So first, I perceive certain jumps that we often have in this discussion, which is, yeah, even if, then what? And I think we still are very much at the even if stage with many governments. So, you know, we all are against nuclear proliferation, and we think it's bad news if any additional country in the world gets hold of nuclear arms. That is established. I think few people would disagree with that. That doesn't mean that we have millions of answers of what we do in that case. Maybe there isn't that much we can do. I mean, we're trying with Iran, but, you know, if tomorrow we find out Saudi Arabia has nuclear weapons, probably there wouldn't be very much we could do about it, but we would know from the beginning that we think that's a problem and we do a lot to try to prevent it. And I don't think that in our foreign policy thinking, a country turning authoritarian is seen with a level of serious concerns that we should have. And that's the first thing I think we really need to establish across the board, that it's understood that autocratization is a real big problem, not only for the population that is directly affected, but for all of us. And I still think that we have to go quite a way there. And I think if we have established that, the policy responses come, and they will depend, of course, very much case by case. And I just give you two examples that I think would have played out differently if we had that understanding. And the one is indeed Hungary. So Fidesz gets elected in 2010 with this absolute majority of votes, which are turned into a two-thirds majority in seats. And then Fidesz starts with a constitutional reform. And at that time, I worked a lot in Egypt, where EU walked around and told all the Egyptians that their constitutional reform has to be really inclusive. The opposition has to be included. It has to represent all of society. Otherwise, there will not be stability, etc., etc. And in parallel, the Hungarian government did a completely government-run, fake consultation process, no talk to the opposition, ramped through big, major constitutional change. The EU was silent. We had good analysis. We have not good regional organizations like the Venice Commission, but it had no impact on policy responses. And I would say if we were in a situation in 2010 where everybody would agree that autocratization is a real serious issue, there would have been a much more serious reaction. The EU could have done things, Germany in particular, could have done things to not allow that to happen. And I think also about the legitimacy question, for me, doesn't seem that complicated. Nobody argued with the democratic elections of Fidesz in 2010. It's what you do then as a government. So democratic governments have to respect the rule of law and work within the system. And if they revolutionize it to make it authoritarian, then we have a good case to be concerned and to complain about that, I think. The other case is just if we had this mindset that we know authoritarian regimes are dangerous, we would just, I think, also in our messaging and our decisions be much more cautious. And some months ago, Ursula von der Leyen went out with the president of Azerbaijan and said, we have a new supplier here of gas, which is great, which Europe needs. And we know Azerbaijan is a trustworthy and reliable partner for us. And I thought this missed really basic instincts. Azerbaijan is a hardcore authoritarian regime. It's not reliable. It will use gas like Russia does. I still think it's okay to get gas from Azerbaijan because you diversify. It's better to have 5 dictatorships than only one that gives you the gas. But to pretend that there's anything more to it, I think is wrong, and also I think quickly fell on her feet when Azerbaijan started attacking Armenia again. And so I think if we just had more clarity on the risk and the danger of these type of regimes, we would already win a lot and automatically make better decisions and communicate also in a more convincing way. All that said, there are, of course, many big unanswered questions, and Daniel made a great job, I think, in highlighting them. The one is that we will need a more fine-grained understanding of all this. We may have hard authoritarian regimes that nevertheless are not so dangerous to anyone. We may have softer electoral autocracies that are very dangerous for different reasons. So it's already clear it's not only the regime type that makes the government dangerous, there are many other elements mixed into that. I thought your example of Jordan and Morocco was also very interesting. I think Jordan doesn't pose security risk, basically, and Morocco does pose some security risk. There's the whole Western Sahara situation, and Morocco is also playing the refugee card quite ably towards Spain and then the EU. So it's all, there are many shades of gray there, I would say. But as I said, I think the first is to establish that that's an issue and that we should take seriously, and that our foreign ministries have intellectual ability to understand the threats, that understand definitions of democracy, that understand the dynamics of political regimes, then we would have gained already a lot. And then what to do in each case, yeah, I could now give you the long list. There's a whole foreign policy toolbox that you could employ. We all know they wouldn't be employed only for democracy, and that's also clear. We don't expect our foreign ministries to become democracy advocacy organizations, but we expect them to treat democracy as a serious concern of security. My last point would be that the geostrategical mixing and the concern for democracy is indeed very, very complicated. And when I'm pushing for saying democracy is an interest, I don't want people to stop thinking it's also value. I think we have to keep both things alive, because otherwise you could incentivize people saying, yeah, it's an interest and we did the calculation and other interests are higher, so we can drop it. So it's important, of course, to say, even if it doesn't serve us any particular advantage in our countries, we should still stand for democracies in other countries. It is also a value. I think in the many compromises that you have to do in foreign policy in our world, where information is traveling very fast and where people know a lot more about what's going on in other countries, one immediate answer is just more honesty. And I think the von der Leyen statement is a case that sounds completely wrong, to talk about Azerbaijan as a reliable partner. And I think our populations are understanding enough that you sometimes have hard choices and you can explain them without insulting maybe your counterpart in another country. But I think that's possible, and some politicians are better in doing that and laying out competing pressures thereon. I'm thinking here of the German economy minister Habeck, who started dealing with Qatar to get liquefied natural gas. And I think at least he sounded a little bit more convincing, because he didn't suddenly pretend that Qatar is this model democracy and such a wonderful trade partner. He didn't give that impression and explain that we are in a hard spot at the moment and have to make some compromises. And I think that's at least the first answer on how to deal with this potential credibility problem.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that. Thank you for the thoughts. I think, yeah, there's lots of different aspects here, and to me, what I hear from the three of you and what I've seen also in the study is that there's really more discussion that may be needed, more thoughts that need to go into this, both with regards to definitions of threats. What does it mean? Where do the threats come from? And also thinking maybe more broadly than immediately turning towards the threat of, let's say, war or the threat of disinformation, but looking more broadly what different types of threats could be there and how could they manifest themselves. Then very much looking into the toolbox of what can be done to support democratic societies, democratic development and growth in different countries when we're thinking of foreign policy, of course, in different countries. And communication about this, and maybe the development of a national security strategy in Germany, the process which is currently taking place, and also as is visible in our study, it's not just in Germany, but in several of the other countries, the strategies are being revised or have just been revised or they're being developed. This can also be a situation where such communication takes place by the governments and by those involved with the citizenry to explain what are they doing, why are they doing it, and how these threats are being defined and how countries are responding to that. There was one more question in our chat. Daniel already shortly addressed this. It's in reference to an essay that was published in Foreign Affairs today by Chancellor Scholz, the German Chancellor, where he says Germany and its partners in the EU, the United States, the G7 and NATO must protect our open societies, stand up for our democratic values and strengthen our alliances and partnerships. But we must also avoid the temptation to once again divide the world into blocks. The question is, what implications would a new bloc divide bring for democratic countries? Maybe this can be a question for some closing remarks by the three of you. For this discussion, there's no other questions, neither in the question and answer section nor in the chat. But because what is written there is a very general statement about what we have to do. We stand up for the values, strengthen alliances and partnerships. It has been said before. There is the danger, of course, that this may lead to a new bloc divide in the world. What does this mean for democratic countries? How could this be avoided? And how should countries like Germany, now that we're looking at the national security strategy in Germany, go about this when finalizing the strategy and then implementing that? So looking to our three panelists here for some closing remarks, and I'd be happy to start with you, Ambassador Leisner.
I'd be happy to. Very interesting questions to start with now. Would we have any new blocks? This is not about blocks, geographical blocks. Autocratization has to be understood as a spider web running everywhere with threads visible in governments, but also in civil society and attitudes from below. It is absolutely impossible to talk about geographic blocks or one set of countries who are on the safe side, another set of countries who are on the not so safe side. It's a complete mess. We have authoritarian tendencies and efforts to take over in every single country in the world. So we're talking about an authoritarian alliance that stretches out with members both from some authoritarian governments, but including, not the least, authoritarian-leaning parties and organizations operating from the world's most stable democracies. Now, this has to be understood. This is not about new geographic blocks. It's about an entirely different ball game. And if we do not understand that, we will not have any methods of dealing with it, because autocratization starts within even us at the individual level. looking at using VDEM as an example again, they have been looking at, of course, what has been efficient when it comes to stop autocratization. And they did a study a couple of years ago. They may have revamped it. I don't know. But what I particularly noticed is that they point at some factors restraining autocratization, and they say that it's very, very important. It has two phases. One is the early phase, and the second one is once there has been an autocratic takeover. And the conclusion is that it is very difficult, not impossible, but extremely difficult to change back an authoritarian regime once it has taken control over the state institutions, because then you alter all the ways that you can achieve a coming back of the democratic norm, since you alter the mechanisms for the elections and you shrink the space for civil society, you kill the independent media, etc. And that leaves very, very little room for going back to a normal democratic situation. So you have to nip it in the bud. And that is where it is important. Now, what has proven to be some of the institutions that prove to be important is to have an independent and strong judiciary. Resistance in the United States when it comes to the January 6 events in 21, actually, yes. And there are also other examples that point at particularly that institution. So I think that strengthening the independent legal systems everywhere in our own countries to make it impossible for a new incoming government to change and take control, because that is what we've seen happening within the EU. It was too easy for an incoming authoritarian-leaning government to take control over the judiciary, constitutional courts, etc., etc. No matter what the Venice Commission does, they cannot stop it. They can only provide advice to a country who wishes to listen to their advice. They have no more means than that. And that is why, even if they work their butts off, they couldn't do anything about this process. And they were being used. They did a fantastic job. But it doesn't matter. So this is what we need to do within every single country, to look at the way that we appoint judges, how difficult or easy it is to change our constitution, etc., etc. So fighting authoritarianism and nipping it in the bud, it starts at home, and also it starts actually at the individual level. So that would be my response to the question. Now, I also want to point to say that it is becoming increasingly important to make the case for democracy. And even though we always know that democracy and human rights are going to be a very, very important set of our values in our countries, in Germany and Sweden respectively, and in all the organizations, the intergovernmental organization that we participate in the European Union, most of the organizations anywhere where we meet as members of the same organization. It's a value. It's a very important value. But it is important to point out that it is also a means. It's an interest. It's a vital interest, not only for our security. Reminding about the excellent set of policy briefs that Bright is Democracy produced. They don't only have on security, but they also prove through examples from their research that democracies are better at economic growth. They outperform autocracies when it comes to economic growth. Democracies outperform autocracies when it comes to social development, to support to poor people, to inclusion. The environmental progress is stronger in democracies and becomes weaker with autocratization. And one important reason is particularly that civil society groups cannot operate freely within a closed society. And they are the ones that are pushing very, very much of the change. And you can even have a mathematical figure of how much more carbon dioxide you will stop from entering the atmosphere, looking at the degree of democracy in a country. When it comes to education and participation of women, etc., on every single account, democracies outperform autocracies. So I think it is really time to make the case for democracy, to produce a new story, tell the real story about what democracy is. It's not about two different value sets. It's about real stuff. It's about the actual development, and not the least the possibility to achieve Agenda 2030. For that, it's absolutely vital to have more democracies in the world. So we also need to remind that authoritarian regimes are not more stable. China has consistently claimed that there is more stability in authoritarian regimes, but it's not, as you pointed out. It's more, it represents a lot of instability. And we can see how China now is dealing with the COVID epidemic that is causing serious uprisings in China, really a threat to stability, because an authoritarian regime has a worse capacity when it comes to dealing with crisis. Amartya Sen, quite a long time ago, he was a Nobel laureate in economics. He wrote a lot about democracy and development, and he pointed out that the difference between democratic regimes and authoritarian regimes is not necessarily that democratic governments are better at making decisions, but it is that when democratic governments make mistakes, because they do, they correct it quicker, because there are mechanisms that force them to correct their mistakes. Otherwise, they will not be re-elected. They will face uproar from the media, from civil society, from the opposition parliament, and they risk losing their positions. Now, an authoritarian government who makes mistakes, there's no risk of losing your positions until you really push it over the top. And then you have the major crisis that may affect the security situation in a much wider geographical context than just your own country. So it is time also for a new story about authoritarianism. To that, we would need to have much more studies done. I believe that if you would have more research into how authoritarian regimes are weakening international cooperation and are counteracting and are pulling out from the rules-based international order, actually actively sabotaging the international rules-based order, and also how they prefer violence to non-violence as a conflict method. Now, that we do have facts for, but not for the two others. We would understand that they wish to be unrestrained, and in their wish to be unrestrained, they are attacking everything that provides us with security and development.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for making this very, very strong case for democracy. I know why we wanted to call you Ambassador for Democracy, but I think you've proven right here that you are. And also very interesting, the point that you made about the need for new stories. And I think particularly new stories with regards to democracy, maybe also with regards to security or the risk coming from authoritarian regimes. And maybe I can use that to refer to another discussion that we are going to have on Wednesday as part of this work that we're doing on the German national security strategy, because we are going to look into narratives, democratic narratives in German security policy. And maybe one of my colleagues can put some more information on that in the chat, or if not, you will also find this on our website. We're approaching really, really quickly the end of our time, but I wanted to give the chance to Daniel and also then to Michael for having some very short closing remarks, if you would like to take that opportunity. Daniel, please.
Thank you, Nicola. I try to remain very, very concise. And just reflecting on the second question as closing remarks, I think no one is interested in creating even ideologically opposing global blocks of authoritarian countries and democracies. But it also doesn't mean that even a deeper level of interconnectedness is necessarily in our interest. Since the early or middle 2000s, Wandel durch Handel or the change to trade practically worked in the opposite direction. It doesn't or hasn't liberalized authoritarian societies. It undermined the democratic integrity of Western countries. And I think it's a fair point if we very consciously always consider whether establishing further ties of cooperation doesn't necessarily hurt our democratic sovereignty, whether it's not making our countries more dependent in technological sense or in the sense of supply of strategic materials from authoritarian great powers, or whether, for example, through further investment ties, we are not offering them strategic leverage over our countries. And I think this is an absolutely fair and sovereign standpoint, that cooperation, but not for any price, and obviously at a very balanced level. And my last words would be that I think one of the big weaknesses of the West is the assumption that we're saying that everyone is playing our game. And I think in no other case is it more obvious than, for example, in the case of Nord Stream. When German stakeholders believed that Russia is playing the very same geo-economic game than Germany. But the Russians haven't played the geo-economic game. They played the geopolitical game. So what for us means a higher level of interdependence potentially and a higher level of cooperation, these ties can be perceived in a fundamentally different way on the other end of the partnership. And I think in the future, it must be better taken into consideration in Western foreign policy thinking than it was over the past 15 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much. I keep it short since we are over time. Just one more response on the Venice Commission, Ambassador. I fully agree with you. I think the fact that the Venice Commission said very insightful things and then they were ignored, this is where I see the problem. So the Venice Commission by itself cannot do much, but these kinds of institutions are as important as the world makes them. And unfortunately, our governments have made them unimportant. They don't refer to them, they don't use the material, they don't make it a center part of policy formulation. I have a bit of a biographical background on all this because I worked in the Human Rights Democracy Department of the European Commission in the early 2000s. I wouldn't claim at all that things worked wonderfully there, but we were a proper department. We had a director who was sitting at the cabinet table, and our life we spent partly in convincing other colleagues that in country X, we have to be a bit careful because, look, the elections weren't free and so on. And that meant that our concerns were woven into the policy-making process. And that's, apart from the formulation, that's why I feel the institutional side is important. But that's also why I'm confident this can be done, because I've seen it being done. How good was the quality also depended, of course, on the commissioners and the political direction and so on and so on. But we should really not think, well, this is too abstract or too far away. How do you make this concrete? No, it's very concrete and a lot can be done about that. Thank you very much. Great to see you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much, dear Ambassador Daniel, Michael, for this very interesting discussion. To me, it seems like just the start of more discussions that we need to have to go more in depth about the what, when, how, why we need to do more with regards to anchoring democracy in our different national security strategies. I'd also like to thank my colleague Dennis Wenzel very much, our outreach officer, who has really done the setup for this meeting, the preparation for this, and a lot of work also on the study. So thank you very much, Dennis. And I'd like to thank the audience, our participants here. I thank you for your interest in joining us today, and I hope that you could take some interesting thoughts and suggestions away from this event. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day to everybody. Bye-bye.